Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Howard Birchman. I am with Housing Innovations. As most, if not all of you know, Housing Innovations works extensively with the Connecticut Balanced Estate Continuum of Care. Joining me this morning from Housing Innovations is Lauren Peretti and Shannon Quinn-Sheeran. So we're delighted to be with you here this morning. Please, if you could, I think we go to the next slide here. There's some instructions here. Yes, so there's some instructions here if you could follow them. If you could put the information in the chat box, provide your name, the agency organization that you work with, your title in that organization or what position you have, and also just a little information about how long you've been involved working with continuum of care programs. Just put them in. As you probably heard in the recording, we are taping this session. So this session, the recording, as well as the associated slides will be posted on the Connecticut Balanced Estate website. We ask you, and I think everybody's doing it, so thank you very much. Please keep your microphone muted unless you are unmuting yourself to ask a question. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question at any time during the proceedings if there's anything that we say that's not immediately clear to you. You can also, if you don't wish to speak publicly like that, feel free, if you have any questions, just to throw them into the chat box, and one of us who is not talking will be monitoring the chat box and we'll be bringing those questions to the group's attention. So, and I think if I didn't mention to this, if you feel comfortable, please leave your cameras on. It really helps us somewhat to be able to see you a little, see the extent to which we're completely putting you to sleep or not, so we can try and adjust things to keep it a little more interesting for you. So thank you. If we could go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is basically, this is section 2 today. If you missed the session 1, that has been taped and it is on the Connecticut Balanced Estate website, so you can catch up with it there. You don't need to watch the recording of this session because here we are doing it live, but we'll be here for posterity too. We're going to talk about income. This is your participants' income, how we determine how much income they have, why we need to determine their income, what the rent calculation is, what kinds of annual recertifications and re-verifications we need to do, what happens when a participant is leaving the program, how to appropriately have folks leave the program. And there are some specific requirements because many of these grants are sponsored by the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So we're talking about their specific requirements. As I said, we're going to talk about income verification and subsidy calculation. So let's get into it. All right. Here is some of the rules here. A couple of things. I believe it was in our earlier presentation, we talked a little bit about what the definition of a family is. And basically, remember, we are able to serve any collection of people who present together and call themselves a family. We treat them as a family and serve them as such. However, that means that anybody who is a member of our family, every one of those people, we are required to examine their income. Anybody who claims to be a member of the family, especially adults, will be expected, if they have income, to pay a percentage of that income at rent. That is something that folks should know at the front end. Sometimes that makes people less willing to become part of the family when they understand their rent payment obligations associated with it as well. As this slide indicates, you need to examine the income of everybody at admission to the program annually at a minimum, but if it is in rapid rehousing, you're supposed to look at their incomes at least every 90 days because the way the rapid rehousing rules work, the amount that people pay in rent is adjusted more frequently than in permanent supportive housing. As I indicated, we are indeed talking about all household members. That includes youth. Remember, however, that when we're talking about young persons below the age of 18, we do not pay any attention whatsoever to any income that they earn. We think it's great if young people do earn some income, provided they can also pursue their educations, but we give them all the money that they earn. The big difference is if we're talking about young people below the age of 18, if they are receiving some benefit income, there are times when young people receive some Social Security benefits as a result of their parents. If that is the case, if young people are receiving benefit income, we do indeed count that income as part of the household's income. We pay no attention to the earned income of people below the age of 18. If they are above the age of 18, but a full-time student, and a full-time student is whatever their educational institution defines as being a full-time student. If they're over 18 and a full-time student, we are only going to pay attention to their income to the extent that it is below $480. We count the first $480 of income of full-time students, but we do not count any income beyond that if they're a full-time student. If our participants notify us that there has been a change of income. Generally speaking, when we're being notified that there's a change of income, it's because their income has decreased. When we're informed of that, we are supposed to, as soon as is practicable, make changes and adjust the subsidy appropriately. If the income increases, generally speaking, under HUD rules, it is acceptable to adjust their subsidy calculations on an annual basis if they're in permanent supportive housing. It really is a requirement of participation that folks provide this income information. HUD will monitor you on the extent to which you are collecting and documenting income information to participants. And therefore, if folks steadfastly refuse, will not cooperate with the provision of income information, that could be grounds for terminating them from the program, since you are indeed required to collect that information from participants. We don't want to ever terminate people for any reasons like this, but it needs to be made clear that you will not be in compliance if you're not collecting that information. Next slide, please. Okay, as we said, use the income, determine the income at least annually. We strongly suggest that you do not do this either just in your head or anywhere else, that there are worksheets that have been established for each one of the major program types, and you should use that Excel spreadsheet. It will save you from making mathematical errors. We want to be clear, this is one of those things that HUD will look at when they're doing their monitoring. They will, if they're pulling participant files, they will take a look at these calculations. If they find that you have made errors in calculating those subsidies, and if for example, you're providing more subsidy than you should be to participants, HUD will basically come back and ask you to repay to the federal government those excess subsidies that you're providing. So it's really very much in your interest to make sure that you are calculating these correctly. It could cost you money in the long term if you're not doing that. As you can see on the slide, for permanent supportive housing participants, if their income changes of $40 or more a month, then you're expected to do an income redetermination and recalculate the subsidies. All projects must recalculate for decreases. If it's permanent supportive housing, you're expected to adjust the subsidy to do those increases in income and reductions in subsidy. What happens is, if basically through your recalculation you determine that the residents deserve more subsidy, basically you should increase the subsidy within the next monthly payment as soon as practicable. If what's going on is the subsidy is going to decrease, you want to give them at least 30 days advance notice of the fact that they're going to have a decrease in their subsidy, so they can have a little warning, so that they can make adjustments in their budgeting, so they have the resources necessary to meet that funding, meet that additional rent cost. Next slide, please. So here it is. These above referenced, these were the rent calculation tools. These are all Excel tools. As you can see, there's permanent supportive housing, there's a rapid rehousing, and of course the youth homelessness demonstration program has slightly different rules on its own, and therefore it has its own rent calculation tool. So please use these tools. Okay, what is considered to be income? So basically, all income to all family members. And remember, all family members are all people who are residing as members of that household. So as I said, employment includes wages, salary, time, overtime, bonuses for people over 18. I said there is the exception for people who are full-time students. You only count the first $480 of their income. If people are getting payments from Social Security, either supplemental security income, Social Security disability income, or good old Social Security retirement income, that all counts, as well as any other pensions, any disabilities, veterans pensions, veterans disability payments, those all count. If folks are receiving unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, any severance benefits from a former job, folks are receiving temporary assistance to needy families, any other direct grant payments from the state. If folks are folks have a court order requiring child support, basically the expectation is that they are receiving that child support. What you need to do, if they are not receiving that child support, you want to document the fact that they are not receiving that child support. But regular child support is indeed considered to be regular income and needs to be counted. So are regular gifts. If, for example, you have a situation where there are grandparents who on a monthly basis are providing the household with, say, $50 a month to make sure the grandkids have got sufficient funds to eat or get milk or something like that. If it's regular payments that are coming in from an outside source, even if those are gifts, you do count them. If what happens is the grandparents provide a gift on Christmas, a gift on the kid's birthday, something like that, and that's basically it, that is considered sporadic, and you would not pay any attention to it at all. So the only time you're going to pay any attention to those kinds of gifts if they are regularly on a monthly or weekly, whatever. But if there's a regular basis that those payments are coming in, then you've got to consider them to be income. If folks are self-employed, then we want to count their business income, but we're only going to count their business income after they've been able to deduct out their reasonable expenses for conducting that business. So we only want to have the net income after expenses if they are self-employed. Next slide, please. So there are going to be instances where participants are going to inform you that they have no income whatsoever. In those cases, it's really difficult to document, find a third-party verification that something is not happening. You really can't do that. So in those instances, if you have participants who tell you that they have zero income whatsoever, you want to get a verification of it. You want to either complete for rapid housing a zero income affidavit, or for permanent supportive housing, this no income certification. It's one way. They are certainly allowed to participate, and indeed we really want to serve people who have no income. Of course, when they come into the program with no income, our goal is to make sure that they have some income. People really cannot live and survive and certainly thrive in housing without any income whatsoever. But if they come into the program with no income, you want to have them fill out the affidavit to make them certain that it really is a serious business and there really is a serious requirement that they do pay rent. Next slide, please.
Howard,
Yes.
There's two questions in the chat. So the first is retroactive SSI or SSD considered income?
So what we're talking about is a lump sum payment that folks are going to receive basically because there was some delay in processing and stuff like that. So what basically we're going to treat that lump sum as we treat any lump sum payment that's coming up very soon. We don't deal with lump sums as single income. It becomes part of their assets, but there is going to be income going forward that you're going to want to pay attention to once those benefits do come. What was the other one?
And then the other one is, what if a client comes into a one-time windfall or lawsuit check? Does this have to be reported?
Yeah, great. So you're jumping ahead of some of the slides that are coming up, but take an example. Let's say they buy a scratch off. Maybe the scratch off don't pay all that much. Whatever lottery ticket they could pay, mega millions. So let's say they get a lottery ticket and they get those mega millions. So in that case, so there are one or two scenarios. When you win a lottery, you either take it as a series of regular payments, over 20 years, something like that. It can be a lot of money in regular payments. If they take it in regular payments, that's considered regular income. It's probably going to push them well over the income limits for your program, but that becomes income. If they take it as a lump sum, you've won $50 million, but in reality, that's only 32 million after taxes or something, like, God forbid, you only have 32 million. Then basically that 32 million becomes a lump sum, and we don't talk about the lump sum. I'll talk about how we treat assets going forward. But even then, with that amount of money, they're probably going to leave your program, and God bless them, and we wish them luck in the future. So basically, if same thing, insurance settlements, anything like that, and inheritance, those are all considered to be lump sums. That's not income. It's considered to be something that is going to one of your assets. And in a couple of slides, we'll talk about how it is that you treat assets.
One more question, Howard, that came into the chat is, what Social Security amount do we use if Social Security is collecting overpayments?
That's a good question. You should do it on the amount that is actually received by the participants, because that is their income. That does happen from time to time. Social Security will have overpaid, and it being the federal government, they have the right. They basically go right into your benefit checks and take that money right out. Similarly, by the way, a lot of folks who are collecting Social Security, they may have their Medicare payments directly debited from their Social Security payments. And we're going to come into these deductions, but you do get a deduction for unreimbursed healthcare expenses, and money that you pay for health insurance premiums is a healthcare expenditure that you're making that is not reimbursed. So there's a potential income deduction there, which we'll talk about as well. Next slide, please. There's a lot of stuff with income. Okay, so basically, it is like in all things with HUD, we really want to look for third-party verification of the income that we receive. So the first thing that we're looking for in all instances is we'd like to get some third-party written documentation. So that would be payment stub, pay stubs if they're getting checks. If they're getting benefits, we'd either be a copy of the benefit check, would be copy of the award letter, award determination letter from like the VA or Social Security saying this is the level of benefits you're going to be receiving. Anything like that. The first thing that we want to do is get a third-party written documentation from an outside source. The great thing about having that in writing is that we can about having that information in writing is that we can then include it in the participant's file, and we have that clear documentation there. The second avenue is to get verbal confirmation from a payer source, call up the employer or something like that, and find out information about what the participant is paid. And remember, what we're looking for is their gross income, not the net income that is going to be on the payroll check. We want to know the gross income that they're getting from that job. So the second thing is to call them up and get that information. If you do that, you want to have in the participant's file the date that it is, the person that you spoke to, and sort of a brief transcript of the information that you received from them as your documentation there. Again, the last self-certification is the last thing that we accept. We want to accept that in the minority of cases, and we're only going to accept self-certification after we've tried to get a third-party written or a third-party verbal confirmation of the income information. It again, obviously the amount that you get verified has got to match with the income information that you were putting in the income and subsidy calculation tool, or else why would you do it? And keep all this information on file in the event that HUD comes to monitor you. Next slide. I think there was a question actually that came in.
There is a question. So how about if they have money taken out for child support? Do we just use the full amount they actually receive, or the amount that they actually receive, or the full amount before the child support deduction?
This one is not nice. And the answer is the latter. It is, unfortunately, you do not give them a credit or basically deduct the income, the required child support payments, even though they are mandated by the courts to make those payments. You're not allowed to take them, to use that as a deduction from their income, and you basically have to calculate their income before you subtract out those child support payments. It's really unfortunate. There are too many instances of people not making those payments, so we don't hate providing additional burdens like this, but that's unfortunately is the way these rules are currently written. Okay, so here are some things. I talked about all the things that you include in income. There are some things that you don't. As I said a couple of times, if the kids are below 18 years of age and they've got a part-time job, God bless them. They get to keep every penny that they make, every tip that they make too. Another thing, this is kind of important. I kind of alluded to this earlier, this notion of temporary, non-recurring, or sporadic income or gifts. So basically, and a classic example that HUD gives of what could count of income that you would exclude from this is, now we're quite a few years away from it, but every 10 years when they do the census, I mean, HUD says very specifically that those people who are paid by the Census Department to go out there and enumerate you, they say don't count that income because that's temporary income. That's like every 10 years. It's only for a number of months within that 10-year period of time. So that's an example of temporary income that you would not count. If, for example, if you've got a participant who every now and then will go outside of Home Depot and do some day labor while they're sitting outside of Home Depot. If it happens one Monday and then a 3 weeks later, they do it on a Thursday or something like that. That's sporadic. We have no idea what folks are going to do. And so you don't count that income. If somebody is basically going outside of Home Depot every day, and that is the way they are supporting themselves, then that is their income. And you're going to want to try and come up with a calculation as to what that is. So again, same thing. If child support is regularly coming in, you must count that those child support payments as part of the household income. If your household brings in foster kids, you do not count the payments that they receive for foster kids. There have times we've seen it. Sometimes there are times people bring in a lot of foster kids and actually need larger units because of all those foster kids, and they're getting those payments. But still, you don't count any of those payments that they receive on behalf of the foster children. So as we talked about those lump sum additions to assets. So again, if there's an inheritance, if God forbid somebody has an accident and they're injured and they get a payment as a result of that injury, that is considered to be another lump sum thing. In the event, if people are, pay funds out of pocket and are reimbursed for any medical expenses they receive, we don't count that as income, any reimbursement they get. Do you know that people have in these assistance programs, if they need it, if they're unable to live independently, do have the right to have the services of a live-in aid. A live-in aid is somebody who's not a member of the household, who's only in the household in order to provide services to a member of the household. And were it not for that need for the services, that person would not be physically present. They're not, although they get an additional bedroom in order to accommodate the live-in aid, they're not a member of the household, so you pay no attention to the income of that live-in aid. That live-in aid, by the way, is allowed to have an outside job, as well as providing those live-in aid services, as long as they are able to meet the needs of the participant that they are providing services to. And if you've got any student receiving financial aid assistance, none of that financial aid is considered income for the purposes of these programs. And this little note on the bottom of the slide is something I've referenced a couple of times, so I will reference it again. So, by the way, there are going to be some changes. These income calculations that you're looking at, I mean, I don't know in my lifetime that I've ever seen these change. I think maybe 30 years ago, some of these numbers were more meaningful than they are today. And I'll tell you, the other thing is, it is likely that in the not too distant future, HUD is going to be implementing a slightly adjusted system, and these numbers will change in the not too distant future, but they have not yet. So these numbers are still the same. So if you've got a household that includes either an elderly person, which is defined by HUD as somebody who's 62 years of age or older, or disabled, which means we know the HUD definition of disabilities. I think we did that in our prior session. But if you either got a disabled person or somebody over 62 in your household, then it's considered to be an elderly disabled household, which means that you are entitled to this one deduction of $400 a year. Yay! Total, because it's an elderly disabled household. Single deduction, one payment, one deduction from the total income of $400 per annum. If there are dependents, that's anybody below the age of 18 or other people who are dependents, full-time students could count as dependents as well. You get a deduction of $480 for each one of those dependents per year. So you could have more than one of those $480 deductions if you've got more than one dependent. Now, in any instance, when you have, as we indicated before, a household that is an elderly or a disabled household, you are entitled to a couple of other benefits. One of those benefits is if you have non-reimbursed medical expenses, and by the way, as I indicated before, that could include any payments that folks are paying for their insurance premiums, any co-pays that they have to pay, any over-the-counter medications that are prescribed by a physician that they have to pay out of pocket for, if they've got eyeglasses that they are paying out of pocket for, any of those kinds of medical expenses. If they're paying out of pocket and the costs of those medical expenses exceed 3% of their gross income, then anything above 3% of gross income counts as it can be deducted from their gross income and is another deduction. Similarly, there's this disability assistance. If you have a disabled household and you're going to incur some expenses in order for a member of that household to go out and work. So for example, if I'm a caregiver to my disabled partner, the only way I can go out and earn money is if somebody comes in and stays with my disabled partner while I'm out going to work. The cost of doing that can be deducted from my gross income. That's a disability expense. Similarly, if I'm a person with disabilities, I have a job, but I've got mobility impairments. The only way I can get to that job is because I need a van, a wheelchair equipped van that can take me there. Basically, the cost of that wheelchair equipped van could be a deduction because that basically is essential equipment that allows a disabled person to either work or be housed. So any expenses associated with that could also, the extent to which they exceed 3% of gross income as well, can be a deduction. You only do that 3% of gross income once. So if people qualify both for excess medical costs and disability assistance, you only subtract out 3% of gross income once. And then the final deduction, this goes to all households, is for the reasonable cost of childcare to promote worker education. So that's important there. You're really only going to pay for or allow a deduction for childcare if people are using the childcare to either be working or to increase their education to allow them to work or get a better job. If they're using childcare in order to be able to work, the deduction for the childcare cannot exceed what they are earning on that job. So if I'm earning $200 a week from my job, I can't deduct $300 a week in childcare. I could only deduct $200 a week in childcare. And of course, reasonable is important. You know, if the typical cost of childcare in your community is $100 a week, and you are paying $500 a week, that would not be considered to be reasonable, and that would be an excess deduction and would not be allowed. And rapid rehousing uses its own set of rules, unfortunately or fortunately, so these deductions do not apply in the situation of how rapid rehousing works. I think a question came in.
They did. So the first question that came in is, what if the live-in aid is a family member of the person? I think this was referring back to the previous slide.
Well, the definition of a live-in aid is somebody who would not be living in the household if they were not there to perform the duties of a live-in aid. So a spouse, for example, would not be a live-in aid because they would be living in that household regardless of those duties. So I mean, basically, if they are a family member, they're not going to be, they are not a live-in aid because they would otherwise be living in that household. Now, an exception to that could be if they're not an immediate family member. So for example, let's say we've got somebody who is like a single adult and needs the assistance of a live-in aid. That single adult is beyond the age of majority. His mom decides that she is going to move in and provide that assistance. Under those circumstances, you know, a single adult would not otherwise be living with their mom. So therefore, under those circumstances, the mother could indeed qualify as a live-in aid. But really, in order for that family member to qualify, it would be a family member who would not, if they weren't doing that live-in aid, would not otherwise normally be living in the same unit as that person with disabilities that they're assisting. So that's the important distinction, is they're not the kind of immediate family member that would otherwise be living together. And I think you said there was another, two more.
Yeah, two more questions, Howard. So if paying medical insurance premiums out of their Social Security, do we use the amount before the deduction as the income amount?
No, it would be the total amount of the Social Security, but they could potentially take that deduction for the insurance premium as an excess medical cost.
And then
Medicare is going to be deducted from your Social Security check.
And then, do we need proof of education if they are getting education for the child care deductions?
You'd want to see some documentation that they are enrolled in some kind of an educational program. Yes.
I think that's it.
Okay. Then let's go on to slide number next. Okay, we made mention to, whoops, go back. We made mention to assets a couple of times. Here we go. Whoops. So assets, remember, assets are things that one owns. I mean, assets can include both cash assets. Assets could include, you know, real property, things like that. Assets could include a motor vehicle. Basically, you know, the first $5,000 in assets, we pay no attention to it whatsoever. So folks can have small checking accounts, savings accounts, things like that with dollar amounts that are below $5,000. You don't need to pay attention to it whatsoever. If folks have assets that are greater than $5,000 in value, you aren't going to pay attention to it, but you don't count that asset above $5,000 as income. What you do is you impute income to that asset. You impute income to that asset based on what had been considered the passbook savings rate. I don't believe they've changed it yet. We know interest rates are really going up now, but we're still using this very low rate. It's 0.6%, which means as this formula is showing, you multiply 0.006 times the amount of the asset. So as this example shows, if they had $50,000 in a savings account, God bless them, but we're only going to count $300 of that as income during the course of the year. So assets, if things are assets, also, as I indicated, assets could be other than cash. It's possible that people could own a piece of real property somewhere. If it is something that's other than cash, you can deduct from the value of the asset the cost that you would incur in turning that asset into cash. So if it is a piece of real property and in order to sell it, you're going to have to pay a real estate broker commission. You may have to pay some transfer fees and things like that. So you could take your $50,000 piece of property and say, you know, I'm going to pay a 6% commission. I've got some transfer fees, so that actual, at the end of the day, the real value of that asset to me is only $45,000, and that is the value that you would use. Next slide, please. Do I use gross or net income? So again, for the most part, here, this is a good example here. So in permanent supportive housing and in transitional housing, you're going to, if this question has come up a couple of times, use the gross income. Again, if it's Social Security, it's that income before any deductions for Medicare or deductions for overpayments or something like that in the past. And that's going to be the case for, again, as you can see, permanent supportive housing or transitional housing. There is the special provision. We know both rapid rehousing and YHDP, God bless them, have their own separate sets of rules and things like that. So under this case, it's there is a 65% on the tenant contribution for the YHDP rapid rehousing. So we use gross income for that. Any rapid rehousing that is other than YHDP, we're going to look at their income after the deductions to calculate how much it is of that income people are paying for rent. Remember, under rapid rehousing, people pay a much greater share of their income for rent, and therefore we want to use that lower figure of the adjusted to make sure that it is indeed workable for those households.
You've got another question that came in, Howard. What if someone was awarded a workers' comp settlement and is no longer able to work?
Well, that settlement would probably, again, if it's a lump sum, we would treat that settlement as a lump sum. And we would treat whatever their current income is. I mean, and if their income is a zero income after that settlement, then we treat zero. If they're collecting unemployment or any kind of benefits, stuff like that, we'd count the benefits. But that workers' compensation, if it comes to them as a lump sum, we'll treat it as a lump sum and not as as ongoing regular cash.
So then there's a question about the rate at which we impute income from assets, Howard. So the question is, why is it 0.6% specifically? And then someone said that they believe that you use that amount as an example amount.
Well, you know, because that, what you are supposed to use is the passbook savings rate. And for the longest time, and I think it's still at the moment, that is what the feds consider to be the passbook savings rate. That is exactly the specific amount that you use to calculate the value of the assets.
And then we've got somebody that has their hand up.
Hi.
I think you're muted. There you go.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Too proud, but you.
I'm well, thank you. I was just listening to the question regarding if you get some kind of compensation and you're disabled, I think it was, and you get a lump sum. Now, you said that they would have to pay taxes on the whole lump sum. My thing is that the doctors get a third, the attorneys get a third, and you're left with a third. So should you be paying a third, or would you be paying the whole lump sum?
No. So in that case, we're really only, I mean, so if it is like a legal thing like that, and, you know, class act suit like that, yeah, obviously the attorneys, you know, are going to, they often do that on speculation. So they're going to take, as you say, take a third off the top. We're not going to pay attention to that. We really only want to talk about, in that case, the funds that are actually going to the participant. And then if it is that lump sum thing, we're going to just, again, we're going to assume that they're putting it into the savings bank, and we're just going to, well, actually, if they put it into a savings account, we will have actual interest that they will earn from that, and we'll take a look at what that actual interest payments are. And that interest payment is what we'll consider to be their income.
Okay, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Okay. Oh, okay. Here we have a Zoom poll. I think, are we going to launch her?
Yep, Shannon's going to launch it.
Okay. So these are tough ones, because in these Zoom polls, you got to answer not one, but 3 different questions. So you have to answer, each one of these are separate true, false questions. Question number 1, providing documentation of income is optional for participants in a Housing First project, true or false? Providing income documentation is optional. Question number 2, Joe babysits for his niece 1 day a week and gets paid in cash. This income is countable when calculating rent. Question number 2, true or false? Do we count his babysitting income that he does each week? And finally, Ron and Jeremy are both disabled and consider each other family. They live in permanent supportive housing and each receive the disability deduction, $800 a year total when calculating their household rent. So we have 2 disabled people. Do they get 2 disability payments of $400, 2 disability deductions of $400 per annum? So is providing documentation of income optional? I think, are we ready to, have we gotten a lot of responses?
We're at, well, yeah, we're almost at 50%. So, okay, I'll go ahead and end poll and share the results.
Okay. No, I mean, although the first one was kind of a trick question to throw in that Housing First thing there, which kind of maybe thrown somebody off. No, income documentation is not optional. For any participants, it really is a requirement. As we said, really sustained refusal to provide that could even be potential grounds for folks being terminated from the program, because you are mandated to do that. If Joe, again, and so Joe, so overwhelmingly folks got that correct. So great on this one. The Joe one was a little trickier, I think, maybe because it said that he was being paid cash. But basically, what's the key thing here is he does it 1 day a week. It's regular. He's getting paid cash. It is therefore reportable because it's a regular source of income. So that actually would be, the income is calculable. So that one is true. So those folks who got that correct. And Ron and Jeremy, this is, we said pretty clearly, unfortunately, although that $400 deduction is bupkis, it is the total deduction that you can ask for. So you can't get 2 of those. There's only 1 single $400 deduction for a disabled or elderly household. And that's it. If there are dependents, you can have more than 1 dependent deduction, but only 1 elderly disabled household deduction. Okay. Oh, did you share these results? I think you did. Yes. Okay. That's the end of that poll. Okay. Little stuff about utility allowances in reimbursements. So remember, and I think we talked about in the last session, it really is important that for all participants, you have a copy of their lease in the participant file. The lease, among other things, is going to tell you, it must specify what utilities are the responsibility of the landlord and what utilities are the responsibility of the tenant. Therefore, you are able to the extent that and what you need to do is you calculate the amount of utility reimbursement folks are going to receive based on your local PHA's utility allowance schedule. The utility allowance schedule is basically going to talk about appliances and the kind of fuel, whether it's electricity or gas, that are propelling them. And basically for each one is going to have a dollar figure associated with it. Folks are, to the extent, so basically any utilities that are not included in the rent, you calculate using your PHA's utility allowance how much credit people are going to receive. Then in an earlier calculation, you determined how much it is that folks are required to pay for rent, that 30% or of their adjusted income or 10% of their gross income. You add up that utility allowance, say that when you calculate out after deductions, I am 30% of my adjusted income is $100. And therefore my required monthly rent would be $100. Then you go and you look at what the utility allowance is for the utilities that are not included in my rent. My utility allowance is $85 to cover my refrigerator and my heat. So therefore, I'm required to pay $100 a month. You're going to give me a credit of $85 because that is what I'm credited towards paying for utilities. There's $15 a month remaining. That additional $15 a month is what I pay directly to the landlord. If my required monthly payment was equal to the utility allowance, basically, I would be responsible for the utility allowance. All of the remaining rent subsidy would go directly from you to my landlord. If my required monthly payment was below the utility allowance, if my utility allowance was $85, I'm only required to pay $50 in rent in month, then basically I'm going to be credited with $50 towards my utilities. The remaining $35, you are either going to pay to the utility or you're going to pay directly to me. You can go either way. We generally suggest that it's better to pay it to the utility because this way you're assured the payments are going and being applied to utilities. But if you do it that way, prior to doing it, you've got to get a release of information from your participant, allowing you to have those communications and to make those payments directly to their utility company. And yes, and Lauren has just clarified here that it's really, when you're looking for the utility allowance schedules, you go on it, base it on the PHA that covers the majority of the area that is served by your particular project. Think that's it. Oh, and there's also a link. We did there is an extensive webinar that we did just on this topic. And if what I gave you is not enough on this, please use that link to get even more information.
So I just wanted to make a quick note here, Howard. So if you are a DMHAS CoC rental assistance project where DMHAS is actually the entity that is making the payments, DMHAS does not currently have a mechanism for doing these utility allowance reimbursements. It's something they're working on getting straightened out within the state bureaucracy, but there basically is no way currently for participants in those DMHAS CoC rental assistance projects to collect that utility reimbursement, but all other projects in the CoC should be, it is a HUD requirement, and so all other projects should be doing this.
Great. And next slide. Yes. So basically there are, this for every CoC. HUD developed the rapid rehousing program, basically gave every CoC the opportunity to basically design how much it is that people have to pay in rent, how much subsidy they receive, how long they can get the subsidy for, how many times they can come back and request that subsidy. These are all left to the discretion of the CoC. So basically these are all in the written standards for the Connecticut Balance of State. We're going to review those in just a second. Yeah, so we're going to read the second. Under permanent supportive housing, there really is no discretion. You have to pay that required rent, as we discussed. Okay, so these are the rapid rehousing rent payment standards. As you can see, it really varies substantially from month to month. In month one, you can pay 100% of the rent and any applicable utility allowance, and you can provide the security deposit as well. As you can see, after the first month, for months 2 to 6, there's the expectation that folks are going to pay 30% of their net income towards rent. After the 6th month, folks are considered to pay 60% of their net income for rent after their utility allowances. And then Oh, I see. And if folks, this is folks who are in rapid rehousing, if they have been approved to move on to permanent supportive housing, they will just be paying their rental contributions the way on the subsidy calculation for permanent supportive housing. Under rapid rehousing, basically folks just get 12 months worth of assistance. There is a possible extension for 24 months. The regulations allow up to 24 months of assistance, but those are supposed to be exceptional circumstances. Overwhelmingly under rapid rehousing, folks should get just 1 year's worth of assistance. And basically when their household income is equal to or greater than 60% of the gross rent, then the subsidy assistance is no longer paid. So our goal is to get folks to have income, to have sufficient income to cover the rent without the subsidies. There are couple of links that are being put in the chat box for there are a lot more resources to help out on the rapid rehousing stuff. Lauren, did you gonna add something here or no? Okay. And then finally, or maybe not finally, but for permanent supportive housing, there's none of those variations. Basically, their rent payment is going to stay the same during their participation in the program. Remember, their rent cannot exceed these figures: 30% of their adjusted income, 10% of their gross income. If they are receiving welfare, general assistance, and they're within that payment, is that assistance payment is a sum that is specifically allocated towards housing, then that amount for housing would be the maximum that could be paid. Unlike, a lot of us are familiar with Section 8 or the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or even public housing, where there has long been a rule that there is a minimum rent that folks must pay regardless of whether they have any money or not. That does not apply to the continuum care program. There's no minimum rent. If people have zero income, they pay zero rent in the continuum of care programs. Please do not impose a minimum rent on participants in these programs. Next slide, please. And basically, these are to help people understand the kind of benefits they're going to receive. There are 2 sample letters that you should provide to folks if they're getting permanent supportive housing through DMHAS. It is an approval and payment letter. Basically, this letter is going to identify the participant, is going to identify how much they need to pay on a monthly basis, and it's going to talk about how much monthly subsidy they're going to get for their rent. Similar, same thing with rapid rehousing. It's going to give them a letter that's going to tell them what financial assistance they're going to receive. We want to give this all in writing to folks so they understand and have that in front of them in their participation in the program. So make sure you give these letters to your participants. So again, you can pay an initial payment in security deposit. I mean, continual care funds are scarce and we want to use them as judiciously as possible. So you want to pay as little as you need to secure the unit. However, there is some flexibility. If you got participants who are non-elderly, which means they're below 62 years of age, in the state of Connecticut, you're allowed to provide up to 2 months rent as a security deposit. If that's the way to get a landlord to agree to rent to your program participants, then you want to use those 2 months worth of security deposit. Under Connecticut law, if people are elderly, you can only charge 1 month worth of security deposit. In a state like Rhode Island, nearby Connecticut, there's a statewide law that folks can only charge 1 month's worth of security deposit. So get rent units over in Rhode Island, pay attention to that. But generally speaking, you shouldn't be doing that. If for permanent supportive housing, you can also upfront pay the first and last month's rent. So you could potentially give 4 months worth of rent at the front end, the first month's rent, 2 months of security, and the last month's rent. Sometimes providing all that money upfront helps to convince a landlord to rent to your participants. So you can do it. If it's DMHAS, though, they typically only going to pay for 1 month's security and the first month's rent only. They're not going to do the last month's rent or in that second month of security deposit. And next slide, please. Okay, and is that you?
I think I'm picking up, yeah.
Yay, okay, well, it's been fun talking at you, and I'm going to stay here to help answer questions, but I'm going to shut up for now.
Thank you, Howard. Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren Peretti with Housing Innovation. So we are going to talk now about recertification. So in our PSH, Permanent Supportive Housing Projects, you're going to be required to redetermine how much income people have coming into their household and recalculate the tenant portion of the rent, at least annually, as Howard said, or when there is any kind of either increase or decrease in income of more than $40 per month. And you are going to be required to notify tenants before that recertification date, right? So you want to give them a heads up before the recertification date. DMHAS requires for their projects that that notification happen 90 days before the recertification date. You probably, 90 days is a long time before, so you're probably going to want to remind people a number of times coming up to the date about that recertification date and everything that they need to provide. And I think it's really intended to give people notice because they do have to provide all their income documentation to you at that recertification date. So the things that are listed here on this slide are the things that DMHAS requires be included when you send that recertification notice. I won't go through all of them. But you do want to make sure whether you are a DMHAS PSH project or a non-DMHAS PSH project, you do want to make sure that you are doing that written notice of the recertification and that you are maintaining that written notice of the recertification in the participant files. It is something we will look for if we come and monitor your program. So this slide really highlights some of the key recertification requirements, both for permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in the left column, and then for rapid rehousing in the right column. So you can see that in our PSH and our transitional housing programs, we're going to recertify at least annually. And as Howard said, in our rapid rehousing programs, we're going to redetermine income and redetermine rent at least every 90 days. In our permanent supportive housing programs, we are also, in addition to that annual recert, going to recertify whenever their income goes up or down by more than $40. And in our rapid rehousing programs, we're only going to do that when their income goes down by more than $40. We're not going to require people to pay more in rapid rehousing if their income goes up. So you can also do these changes if a decrease of less than $40 in income would result in some sort of rent decrease that would be meaningful for the person. By all means, feel free to recalculate for decreases that are less than $40. And then also on this slide, there's some links to tools and forms that are required in our rapid rehousing projects at each 90-day review. I won't go through this all. And linked here is the exception form that Howard referenced earlier, so that, again, if you are going to be extending rapid rehousing financial assistance to someone beyond the 12 months in those rare circumstances, that the form that you need to file, you must file this form and get that exception approved in order to be able to do that. So these are requirements that apply whenever you are doing an annual recertification, right? So you're always going to do the housing quality standards inspection again. And remember that from our last session, that you've got to make sure that that unit passes HQS. If it does not pass HQS, you're going to suspend rent payment until it does pass HQS. You're going to do the rent reasonableness determination. And we went through all of these things in detail in our last session. So if you missed that session, please check out the recording. You're going to do the environmental review if there are any new units, right? If the person's moved to a new unit and you don't already have an environmental review on that unit, you're going to add that unit to the list that's been signed off by your responsible entity. And if that unit is located in one of the coastal counties, you're going to make sure that you check that coastal barrier resource map. You are going to, of course, redetermine income and redo the rent calculation using either the PSH rent calculation tool, the regular rapid rehousing rent calculation tool, or the YHDP rent calculation tool. And use of those tools is required for PSH and rapid rehousing projects, right? So it's not optional. You've got to use that tool, and we will look at that when we come out and monitor. You're of course going to execute a new lease. And if it's a scattered site PSH project, you are also going to, if it's a new unit, execute a new HAP contract, or if it's an extension of a lease on an existing unit, you're going to do the HAP amendment, which we'll look at in a minute. And then important, you've got to make sure that you also do the HMIS annual assessments. And that is important both because it collects information that you report to HUD in your annual progress report or APR, as well as it collects information that's going to be used by CT BOS to evaluate your project. And those evaluations impact how you score and are ranked, which can impact your funding. So getting that annual assessment done is really important. And then depending upon who the fiscal conduit is for your project, if you are a PSH project that uses DMHAS to get the rent paid, or you're a rapid rehousing project that uses either ACT or CCADV, each of those fiscal conduits also have certain rules, and all of those things are outlined. The required kind of financial forms are outlined in the relevant operations guide, either rapid rehousing or PSH.
Lauren.
Yeah.
There's a couple questions. I think from the 2 slides previous, $40 a month, that said you're required to do a recertification for gross monthly income, increase or decrease $40 a month. They're asking, is that at any point of income being received?
Yeah, so anytime in a PSH project, anytime somebody either gets $40 more or $40 less per month, you're going to do a recert. And in a rapid rehousing project, anytime their income decreases by at least $40 a month, you're going to do a recert apart, in between the required 90-day reviews.
And then there's another question that was from before that we missed. And this is from Howard's slides. When Howard was referring to a refrigerator in the calculations, is the refrigerator calculation referencing the electricity for it or the rental of a refrigerator?
Sorry, I was muted. The electricity for it's utilities that we're talking about here. So it's the electric for it.
Thank you.
So I'm actually going to skip this next slide about fees. We're going to cover this in detail. We're running a little bit behind, and we're going to cover this in detail in the sessions that Howard and I are doing coming up in June. So I'm going to skip this, and we're going to go to the poll.
Before we go into the poll, there's one more question that just came in. Do you have to wait until the environmental review is approved before a client can move into a unit?
Good question. There's really nothing that you need approved for the environmental review. It's really just a matter of adding that. As long as the unit is not in a coastal barrier resource unit, and if it is in a coastal barrier resource area, then you just can't rent the unit. But there really is nothing that needs to be approved. It's really a matter of just listing that unit on the existing signed form that your responsible entity has already signed for you in most cases. Now, in some cases, the responsible entity may say to you, every time you add a new unit, you've got to have me re-sign the form. If that's the case in your locality, I wouldn't say that you have to wait to house the person until that responsible entity signs off. Go ahead and house them, and have the signature on file as soon as you're able to get it. All right, okay. Zoom poll.
It is launched. So, what determines the utility allowance amount I should enter into the rent calculation tool? The current month's amount shown on a participant's utility bill, the amount shown on the DOH or PHA utility allowance schedule, or C, the amount of arrears shown on the participant's utility bill? That's question number 1. The second question, how often must HQS and rent reasonableness determination be completed? Monthly, twice a year, or at least yearly? So give it a few more seconds for try to get to 50% participated. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And
so
do you want me to share the results?
Yeah, if you could share the results, that's great, Shannon. So the correct The correct answers here are what determines the utility allowance amount I should enter into the rent calculation tool. So that is the amount shown on either the DOH or the PHA utility allowance. And Lisa Callahan, I should have said this earlier, if our folks that are on from DMHAS or DOH, please feel free to chime in if there's something that we get wrong or are missing. And Lisa chimed in, chatted me privately to say that in the DMHAS CoC rental assistance program, they are using the statewide DOH utility allowance schedule. So, by all means, follow the procedures that DMHAS has laid out there. So it's fine to use that DOH statewide utility allowance schedule in those programs. And then lastly, the correct answer is how often must HQS and rent reasonableness determinations be completed? And the correct answer there is annually. Thank you, Shannon, for doing our poll.
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in for a second, Lauren. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Lisa.
Yeah, so for, as many of you know who do the PSH, I send that out annually, the utility allowance that I get from DOH. I'm in contact with Steve DeLella regarding that. And as you know, it hasn't changed. The amounts have not changed in a while. I did recheck and they still have not changed. So the one that I sent out is the current one that we're using. So if anybody has any questions, regarding that after, please feel free to email me. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. So, I think sometimes people get confused because these are all housing first programs and they think, well, it's a housing first program. There's nothing we can do if the person's, partying all night and disrupting their neighbors or not paying their rent or in other ways violating their lease. And that's just not the case, right? So lease enforcement is absolutely critical. It is the landlord's responsibility, as with any other kind of housing, whether that landlord is a private market landlord or your nonprofit is the landlord. Enforcing the lease is critical. And it is a landlord responsibility. And so when there is a lease violation, we do want to make sure that as the landlord, if we are the landlord, that we are issuing a written notice to help make sure that the tenant understands what the structure of the lease is, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and to really give the service provider then the opportunity to offer services and to help the person to comply with the lease. So lease enforcement is the owner's responsibility, but helping people to understand their lease obligations and connecting them to whatever services they need in order to help them to comply with the lease is the service provider's responsibility. And so as a service provider or a housing provider, you want to make sure that you're coordinating with the owner regularly and encouraging the owner to really proactively enforce that lease and copy you on those written lease notice violations. And then there's also a requirement in our PSH programs that we are meeting with people regularly in their units, right? When you meet with people in their units, you're going to see things that you're not going to necessarily know and identify service needs that you wouldn't necessarily identify in a community-based or an office-based meeting. So the requirement for our PSH projects is that you meet with people in their unit at least once in the initial 30 days of tenancy and at least every 6 months thereafter. Although generally speaking, particularly if you're working with folks who are very high need, you're going to want to be meeting with them in their unit even more frequently than that. Our PSH projects are also required at least annually to do this thing called the health and safety checklist. It's linked here on this slide. And this is really, it's not, policing people's housekeeping, it doesn't matter if their socks are all over the floor. It really is looking at critical health and safety issues that would cause the unit potentially to fail HQS on the next HQS inspection. And you want to do that about 6 months from the HQS inspection so that you're going in, you're putting eyes on the unit at least twice a year and doing an inspection of the unit at least twice per year. All right. So, and then of course, we always want to be doing everything that we possibly can to help people maintain their housing and, you know, and not use their unit. And so when you've got people who are violating their lease and are at risk of losing the unit, you want to make sure that you are leveraging all the resources that are available to you in your local area. Certainly, if you're the housing provider, you want to make sure that you're linking people to case management services and that you're notifying the case manager and that the case manager's intervening. When someone is at risk of being terminated from the program or evicted, you want to make sure that you notify your CAN. This is a Connecticut Balance of State requirement. You want to, and then the CAN will convene a case conference. And the idea there is for the community, right, to collectively to do some problem solving and determine what's the best intervention, what resources do we have available together to help this person stay stably housed. And then you also, of course, want to be connecting people to whatever kinds of mainstream resources exist. If they've got utility arrears, is there some resource for paying either utility arrears or rental arrears that you can connect people to, for example. And we'll talk a little bit later about, you know, obviously there are going to be some circumstances where you are not able to keep someone stably housed and they're going to get evicted, and or you are going to need to actually terminate their assistance. And we'll talk about both of those scenarios in a moment. Remember that whenever you are terminating someone's assistance, that people are going to have the right to appeal that termination decision. And so you want to make sure that you're following all of the procedures and you're documenting all of the good work that you did to try to get them to be able to retain their housing. The more that you document, the less likely that decision is going to be reversed on appeal. All right, so when someone is not complying with their lease, this is in our lease-based housing and PSH, right? The owner, it's like any other lease-based housing. The only way for the owner to involuntarily remove that person from the unit is through the legal court eviction process. Now, oftentimes we know that having an illegal an eviction on your record is very harmful to the tenant, can make it even more difficult to rent another unit in the future. So by all means, intervene and negotiate between the tenant and the landlord to try and avoid a formal eviction whenever possible. And we really want to be in regular communication with landlords so that we know when someone is at risk of eviction, right? So that we don't find out 6 months down the road that they haven't paid their rent, right? We want the landlord to be telling us that right away the first month when they're behind on the rent, so that we can try to wrap around some services for the person and get them back into compliance with their lease. I think we've got some questions that are maybe coming into the chat. Is there anything we need to respond to, Shannon?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, thanks. All right, so it's also really important to remember that just because someone gets evicted from their unit, that does not automatically mean that we are going to exit them from our CoC project, right? Whenever possible, we want to maintain their enrollment in the project and help them to find a new unit and to rehouse, you know, work with the person to get new housing. So you do not need to terminate somebody from the project just because they have been evicted. Now, there are reasons where you are able to terminate people from the project, and those are clearly outlined in both the PSH operations guide and in the rapid rehousing operations guide. If you do have to terminate somebody from the project, then it does not preclude them in the future from getting CoC assistance again, right? So there's no limit on the number of times that people can, we don't give up on people in the CoC program, and there's no limit on the number of times that somebody can reapply for CoC assistance. They would need to go back again through the, once they've been terminated from the project, right? They would need to go back again through the CAN process, and you know, depending on how long they were housed, they may or may not be eligible right away, right? So they're going to have to redetermine their eligibility as well as be reprioritized by that CAN if they were terminated, exited from the project. Now, if you keep somebody enrolled just because they're evicted, that's one of the reasons to keep people enrolled when they're evicted, is because they're still in the project, right? So you don't have to reestablish eligibility until the point at which you exit them from the project. So whenever we are, you know, at risk of having to exit someone from the project, we always want to, of course, have multiple discussions with them about what's going wrong, what specifically they need to do to correct the problem, and how we can help them to correct the problem. When you are in a permanent supportive housing project, you are required to issue a written warning letter that really documents the content of all of those discussions, right? What's the reason why they're at risk of being terminated, you know, who they should contact to get help. And you want to make sure that that is sent by mail and that you copy the case manager. If you are not the case manager, if you're the housing provider, you copy the case manager, and you're going to maintain that, that warning letter in the person's chart. Similarly, in our rapid rehousing project, and all of this again is outlined in the operations guide, you're first going to have a conversation. In rapid rehousing program, we call this a reset discussion, right? You're going to, you know, review what the expectations are of the program, what the person needs to do to correct the problem, you know, visit the housing stability plan. And then again, you're going to document everything that was discussed and what the next steps are in order for the person to maintain the assistance. All of that should be documented and sent in writing to the participant. There are going to be circumstances, both positive circumstances where someone is thriving and no longer needs your help, and you're going to exit them from the program because they no longer need the assistance, and then times when, you know, the person is not succeeding in the program and is going to be not a positive exit. And so we're going to go through now what all of the requirements are when you are exiting somebody from projects. So the first set of things, whenever you are exiting someone from a CoC project, whether it's a voluntary exit or an involuntary exit, whether it's wonderful circumstances or really unfortunate circumstances under which you're exiting them, you are always going to give them a written notice that you are terminating their assistance. The only exception to that is when the person is deceased, right? So in that notice, you're going to write the reasons why they're being terminated, and it could be because you've gotten a Section 8 voucher, and congratulations, right? You're moving on from the program. And you're going to always notify them of the right to appeal the decision, and we're going to go through some of the details on that in a moment. If they do appeal the decision, you are required to give them written notification of the decision on that appeal. You're going to make sure when you issue that that notice of termination that you also include notification of their VAWA rights. And so then the Violence Against Women Act, we went through this in detail last time. The notice of occupancy rights and the incident self-certification form should be included, and those are linked here. And sometimes you don't know where the person, you're exiting them because they've disappeared and you don't know where they are. And if that's the case, just send the notice to the last known address that you have for them. If you have an email for them, send it to their email. And you know, if they've gotten their mail forwarded, which I think is probably pretty unlikely with our folks, the post office will forward that notice to them. Okay, so these are some additional requirements that apply to what you're going to do if you're terminating assistance in permanent supportive housing. And again, all of this is laid out in detail in the operations guide. If you are a DMHAS permanent supportive housing program linked here is a sample warning letter. So we talked about before the warning letter requirement. Some of these resources are going to be helpful to you, even if you're not a DMHAS project. You might want to check them out and use them. So there's a warning letter sample here. There are the reasons why, the rules, right? The reasons why people can be terminated from DMHAS PSH are here. And then there's the two different kinds of letters that you're going to provide to them. The first one being the letter with the informal hearing request. And then if that's happened and they want to, they're not satisfied with the informal hearing and they want to go to the next step, the letter with the formal hearing request. Now, an important thing to remember is that for our PSH projects that are not DMHAS PSH projects, you are not going to use the DMHAS appeals process, right? The DMHAS appeals process is only for DMHAS projects. So if you have a PSH project that is funded directly by HUD, not through DMHAS, then you're going to use the CT BOS grievance policy. And there is a whole webinar that we did on the grievance policy for CT BOS that is also posted on our website. So check it out if you are not familiar with what the steps in that process are. And then lastly, if you're a DMHAS project and you are terminating someone's assistance, you have to let DMHAS know that, otherwise they will continue to pay rent on the unit. So please, please, please be sure that you do that change order. And for other kinds of projects too, if you've got a fiscal conduit who is not your agency or a fiscal conduit who is your agency, be sure you let them know so that we don't pay rent on units that are no longer occupied.
Lauren, we have
very
a
scarce resources. Yes.
question in the chat. If the head of household dies and they have other household members, are we obligated to send letters to them, allowing them to determine if they meet eligibility to become the head of household and keep getting assistance?
I think it's a good idea, Amanda. It's a good question. So you are able to continue assistance, and I think we're going to look at that rule in a minute, till the end of the lease for a household where the qualifying member either is deceased or is institutionalized for more than 90 days. And I would give a written notice to the remaining members in the household to tell them that, that you're going to continue to assist the unit until the end of the lease, and that if they can establish with your help eligibility to remain in the unit, who they should contact if they want help doing that. So these are the requirements that apply when we are, in addition to the ones that apply to everyone in our rapid rehousing projects, and again, outlined in more detail in the rapid rehousing operations guide. We're running low on time, so I'm going to go quickly through this. Basically, the sample letters that you can use, as well as the allowable reasons to terminate from a rapid rehousing program, and the stop payment letter to notify the landlord and the fiduciary agency are listed here. We're going to talk about exit inspections in a moment. So security deposit refunds. So when someone is moving into a unit, you want to make sure that you've documented the condition of the unit. So if there are things wrong with the unit at move-in, take pictures of those things and include them in the client chart, so that way when the person is exiting the unit and the landlord claims that there was some damage that was caused by the participant, you've got photos to show that that in fact is not the case, that damage was in the unit before the participant moved in. So you are going to need to do an exit inspection when someone exits the unit. And then the owner, as with any landlord, is able to, if there's unpaid rent or damages that were caused by the tenant, they can, withhold a portion of the security deposit, as long as what they're doing is in accordance with the laws of the state of Connecticut. And at the bottom of this slide is a good resource if you're not familiar with what those regulations are in Connecticut. Check out that resource. So assuming that there is still money owed, the landlord is obligated to promptly refund that amount. You should, when someone's moving out of the unit, remind the landlord in writing that they are obligated to do that and to whom they should send that refund. For our DMHAS projects, the balance is to be returned to DMHAS, and for our rapid rehousing projects, the balance is to be returned to the participants. So in our projects, you can continue to pay. So this is for a rental assistance project. You can continue to pay up to 30 days from the end of the month in which the unit was vacated. And obviously, if it's occupied by another person, then you can also continue to pay. But even if it's not occupied by another person, you can pay up to 30 days from the end of the month in which it was vacated. And that can be helpful if you've got a unit and a good landlord and you want to hang on to that unit, but you don't yet have someone else to move in. You can continue to pay that landlord for that unoccupied month to hang on to that unit. And then we can also continue to pay when a participant is staying in an institution, jail, hospital, rehab, et cetera, for 90 days or less. If you are a leasing project, because remember, in a leasing project, you as the agency are signing the lease with the landlord, you can continue to pay for the entire lease term, right? You've got to comply with the lease. So you, of course, want to move someone into that unit as quickly as possible. But you can continue to pay beyond the 30 days in a leasing project. And then we said this just a moment ago, that you can continue assistance for the remaining family members beyond the 90 days. If the qualified person dies or is institutionalized, you are required to continue assistance for the remaining family members until the end of the lease. So there's also this useful thing in the HUD rules for rental assistance that allows you to use CoC funds in an amount not to exceed 1 month of rent to reimburse the landlord beyond the security deposit for any damages caused by the participant. And that can, again, be a helpful tool in your ongoing efforts to build goodwill with your landlords. This can only be done one time per participant, and it has to happen when the person exits from the unit. It can't happen while they're still in the unit. And unfortunately, this is not an eligible expense if you are using CoC leasing dollars rather than leasing dollars. I think I'm going to skip this poll, Shannon, because we're running out of time. So, so for rapid rehousing projects, we're in just a moment, we're going to invite everyone that is not from a DMHAS project to hop off, and we're going to talk just with our DMHAS folks. And before we did this, our friends from DOH just wanted us to do a quick reminder. If you are a rapid rehousing project, all of the forms that are required are on the CT BOS website on the resources page. And included there is also a checklist for everything that needs to be in your rapid rehousing participant files, as well as a checklist for everything that you need to do when you are requesting rapid rehousing funds. So now, So now we're gonna be talking specifically about requirements that only apply in DMHAS PSH. So if you are not a staff at a DMHAS PSH project, we invite you to hop off now and enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you for those who are hopping off for joining us. So just a couple more slides here. So these are all of the DMHAS required forms live on our CoC website. So again, on our resource page, there's a section with all the DMHAS forms, as well as a documents checklist for everything that you need to, all the different forms that you need to complete when you are working with folks in DMHAS PSH. So these are some requirements that apply when you are newly admitting someone to a DMHAS PSH project. So the new admissions form, so that includes things like the owner's name, their contact information, their CT supplier information, and some information from the HAP contract. So that you have to make sure you do. The approval letter is super important. That tells the tenant how much they are going to get paid, how much they are going to have to pay in rent, and how much the subsidy is going to pay. It also is where we notify them that they are required to report changes in their income to us. The rental assistance housing certificate. So that's basically the document that tells folks that they are officially approved for the program and they can start with your help searching for housing. So remember that when you issue that certification, folks are going to have initially 60 days to locate the unit. You may extend that for up to an additional 60 days. So it's 120 days initially with your help that people have to find a unit. If you need to extend beyond that 120 days because people have not been able to find a unit, then you've got to get approval for that initial extension from Alice and Lisa over at DMHAS, not Alice and Lisa, Alice or Lisa over at DMHAS. So, and then DMHAS, of course, has their own release of information form, as well as the Federal Privacy Act notice. And then, of course, for all of our folks, we also, if you don't already have one on file, that is still good. You need to get the HMIS release of information form as well. So these are just some other requirements for DMHAS-specific projects. Please, 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 if you are a DMHAS PSH project, be sure that you are using the standard DMHAS lease. We still see this sometimes when we go out and monitor that people are using all sorts of other leases. You are required to use only the DMHAS standard lease, as well as the request for lease approval. So that's completed by the owner. It gets submitted to the LMHA. And it includes who is paying for which utilities. We often see when we monitor that there is a mismatch between this document, the lease, and the rent calculation tool. So all of those things should match. Who pays for which utility should be consistent across all of those documents. You're going to have the owner attest on the owner insurance that they in fact still own the building and that all the forms that they originally submitted are still in effect. You are going to have either do a new HAP contract if it's a new unit, or do the HAP contract amendment to extend the dates of the HAP contract. You're going to do the occupancy continuation form, which is how you gather information about who is living in the unit and what their income and assets are. And then you are going to do the recert payment letter, which notifies the tenant that they've been recertified, and again, what their rent contribution is going to be and what the subsidy is going to pay on their behalf. So these are some of the forms that are required to make sure that DMHAS pays the rent promptly and correctly. And so you need to also get these done, the W-9 and the vendor form, the SP-26. And incorrect information on these forms will delay payment. So please be sure that the forms are both legible and filled out correctly. This is a recent change to the DMHAS process. So it used to be that you submitted the W-9 and the SP-26 to DMHAS. That is no longer the case. You should now be submitting these forms to the Connecticut Comptroller. The address to which you submit them is there, and our friends at DMHAS have also helpfully laid out what the subject line should be and what you should write in the body of the email. So you can just literally cut and paste this information into the email. Also super important, when there are changes, you've got to make sure you complete this change order request, right? We talked about stop payments. If there's a change to the HAP agreement, you've got to do this. And of course, if the HAP agreement has expired, but for some reason you still need a payment to be made, you've also got to do this change order request. The request has two sections, the from section, so that's the original information, and the to section, that's what you are changing the information to. Make sure both of those sections are filled out completely and correctly. If the owner, like the name changes, their tax classification changes, their EIN changes, you've got to also do a new W-9 and a new SP-26. And if the building is sold, you're going to have to do a change order, a stop payment, and a new W-9 and a new SP-26. All of this is laid out in the operations guide. So don't feel like you have to memorize this. check the operations guide. So we are at the end of our time together. We are right at 11:30. We appreciate your time. I see that I think there may be some questions in the chat. I will stay
Yeah, there's
on
some
for a few minutes to answer questions, but by all means, please feel free to hop off. We appreciate